Okay, so for everybody out there, it's sometimes known as a myth that our people did not come from Africa. If there is any proof of this, where and when can one start to dig that up? And is there any truth to the fact that some of us didn't come from Africa, or did all of us not come from Africa, us being the so-called Negro, black, or colored person in this country?
Well, it depends on which angle we're shooting from. If you're looking at the complete totality, what they tell everyone regarding the transatlantic slave trade. So there's a bunch of variables that we would have to look at to find out and to be able to determine whether that possibility for them to even to do what they're suggesting happened, was it possible? So we're talking about the people who coming out of the Middle Ages. We need to look at the shipbuilding industry that would be present during that time. We need to look at whether there were assembly lines to create these ships. We also need to look at the weaponry. And all these things become a factor because of the story. So the story goes is that they took upwards of 20 million people, from Africa. And based on that, the story goes that they brought 20 million people here, or lost a few people, took about 65 to 70% to Central, a Mexico, what we call America today, and then brought the remaining people here. So when we say 20 million, and we also have to put everything in the scope that up until 1650, you can find records that up until 1650, there were only 3,000 recorded enslaved Africans here in 1650. Now that becomes important because we're talking about a number of 20 million. And even if we look at it from, let's say that the trafficking of enslaved Africans lasted up until 1850, and we're being generous with the time periods. So for 200 years, you had to have, on a daily basis, 275 people coming every day. 275 per day. Now, in order to have 275 people coming per day, you had to have a shipbuilding industry that was capable of handling that. So that's one angle that has to be determined. Was there a shipbuilding industry that could handle 275 people coming in to the country per day? Now, when you're looking at that aspect of it, you then have to look at who built the ships, who were the ship designers. There is no record that I've been able to find of an architect for a ship, for the so-called slave ships. I've been able to find no record of an architect. Now, understanding that shipbuilding is based on mathematical preciseness, you have to be extremely precise. So when you start looking at the type of ships that were built, you have the ships that may have weighed, let's say, 60 tons. And these were going to be some of their warships and their trade ships. And what you'll find that they tell you is that they took those warships and those trade ships and converted the hull. And converted the hull to storage units that can hold people. And this is the story. Well, a ship that's let's say upwards of 60 tons, because that would be one of the bigger ships. Now they had some ships, very rarely, that went higher than that, but those were rare. Okay, because we're talking about a specific type of shipbuilding industry that we have to stay aware of. So to convert a storage unit of a ship, the hull, into a storage unit for human bodies, you would have to have a designer, because it would have to be purposeful to where you can fit a certain amount of people, because we're talking about 275 per day. And that's if one ship can do it. Okay, because for 200 years you need 275, and you can't lose that number, 275. So for every time a ship is docking, one has to be leaving, because it has to be a complete circle going all the time. So that means that you need at least, at the very least, 500 ships. And I'm just being generous, you know, flattering with the numbers, because you actually need 4 more than that. Based on the shipbuilding industry, it wasn't possible. There's no architect, and the hull of a 60-ton vessel to be converted into a human body storage unit is not possible. Not if you're keeping the captives alive. Now, in the hull of a ship, especially in those days, this is not a space where you can completely stand up straight. So these ships weren't big enough for that. Okay? So that's one thing you have to look at. So this isn't a space that's like being in a room with a 12-foot ceiling. Okay? Let's say that the total hull was about 5 feet 6 inches. Let's just say that. And that's being generous. Now, they would have to convert that area, clean it out, cargo-wise, to be able to get the people in it. So what happens is that when you look up who's the architect, there isn't one, right? Now the shipping method that they're saying is that they had everyone stacked on top of each other, and that the voyage took 3 to 6 months. And so, as they're voyaging that 3 to 6 months, based on what they're saying, that everyone stacked on top of each other, now, based on that, then the people are now urinating and passing fecal matter on top of each other. And we'll come back to that problem in a second. So it's documented that in 1650, that there were 3,000 enslaved Africans here. 3,000. So their magic number is 20 million. We know that the trafficking stopped in 1850. Let's just say 1850, because we're going to be generous. We're going to make it an easy mathematical equation. So from 1650 to 1850 is 200 years. So to get 20 million people here within 200 years, because 3,000 is basically nothing. So you might as well start from zero. To get that many people here, you need 275 people per day, 100,000 people per year. So 100,000 people per year breaks down to 275 people per day, 365 days a year. So that meant that prior to this enslavement time, that's why you look at the infrastructure that where they were able to build these ships. The possibility of them being able to build the ships. Because the infrastructure would have to be in place that would allow them to do it. And based on study, the infrastructure wasn't there. So now you're saying 20,275 people per day for 200 years. That means that you need at least 500 ships per year to be running. And that's really not giving a true accurate number. You'd actually need more than that. But let's say 500. Because every time a ship docks, there has to be a ship going. So when one docks, there has to be one leaving out. Because it now becomes a circular thing where now it has a, you have to have one for one all the time. And this has to be on a daily basis. That wasn't possible. The infrastructure, there's no mass assembly. All the boats that you see are tiny. These are tiny boats. If you take a 700 square foot place, okay, which is similar to the shop that we're in now, okay, 700 square foot place, and your ceiling being 5.5 feet, cannot stack 275 people, even on top of each other. You would have to cram it so hard that the people literally wouldn't be able to move, not even a little bit. On top of that, it would be body on top of body, because you would have no room for anything else at all. Like there would be no room to be able to put food. They couldn't eat because there'd be no room for them to move. But let's deal with the main issue of what they're saying with the 20 million. The main issue that's prevalent is the fact that if you stack people on top of each other, the fecal matter and the urine, that becomes the main issue. Urine, if left and undrained, produces ammonia, an ammonia smell. That's that smell that when your children go to the bathroom and don't flush the toilet, and you shut the door and then you open it and you smell, you're like, oh, what is that? That's ammonia. It also produces carbonate. Now carbonate, the issue with carbonate being in the air is that it messes with your lungs. It causes lung failure. So if you got people stacked in these areas like that for that amount of time, then now they're going to be dealing with lung failure. So your casualty rate would almost be at 100%. Well, so what they do is now they tell you the story of where they would let the people out. Or actually, before we get to that, the reason that this is happening is because you're in the hull. The hull of the ship cannot have a drain because it's in the water. If you put a hole down there, the ship is going to sink. So there is no drainage down there, and you cannot create a drainage system that runs upwards because it wouldn't have no way of having the power to push it up and out. So that meant that the fecal matter and the urine would literally just be sitting in the hull with the people for days. So even if you brought the people up every 3 days, then for 3 days, those people couldn't open their mouth, they couldn't open their eyes, nothing for 3 days. And that's if they bring them up every 3 days. The other problem is, how would you bring everybody back up? In order to get the person the people on the bottom to be able to relieve and clean himself, if you allowed that, you have to remove everybody. So every 3 days, you're taking every single individual out of the hole. The story is not only plausible, but understanding mathematics and geometry is just a bold-faced lie. We're not even dealing with the fact that if you do the proper research, you find out that the Moors were actually the only seafaring people out there right now, and that the Moors had treaties with the Europeans and were charging the Europeans to even use the sea and the seaports. But that's a whole other issue. We're just going to stay with the story of the transatlantic slave trade. So now we deal with the terrain. So at this point in history, one of the most densely populated places on the planet would be Africa, as it's called today. Knowing that Europeans at this point, during the Dark Ages, their population has shrank 70%. Literally. They lost 70% of their population to disease. So these people probably, at this point in history, are about 3% of the world population. And they want us to believe that they went into Africa and took 20 million people when they wouldn't even have enough manpower to do it, nor would they have known the terrain of Africa at that time. So one of the first things in military strategy you do is that you study the terrain of your enemy if you're taking the fight to him. Meaning that you send scouts in to survey the terrain, because you have to understand what type of supplies, how much water, how much food, all these things you're going to need for that war. So what they want us to believe is that they had ships big enough. We already know they didn't have ships big enough to carry 300 or 400 people. Just didn't have them. Very, very scantily did they have those ships. But they want us to believe that they had enough manpower to round up 275 people per day in Africa. 275 people per day, they were saying that they were rounding up and putting on the ship. And that they had enough manpower to do that. Now understand that during this time, guns are single shooters. And they are reloaded with gunpowder and like little pellets, basically. We had long distance weapons in comparison. Highly accurate spears, bow and arrows, and so on and so forth. The guns that they had were very close range weapons. They were not accurate. They, you know, the way that the velocity and all that which they traveled had to be within a certain foot range to guarantee to hit your target. Whereas we could be from a block away and shoot a bow and arrow or do other things. Now you hear them speak about a particular type of warfare because they call it guerrilla warfare. And it's understood all around the planet to be one of the deadliest means of warfare, and they still study it today. But They're saying that they went and conquered people who practice guerrilla warfare, and they're still studying it. Why would you study us if you defeated us?
Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah. Why are you studying us if you defeated us? That don't make sense. So mathematically, the story doesn't make sense. The story mathematically is completely false. The numbers can't exist because the infrastructure to support the numbers doesn't exist. It just simply doesn't exist. And all we have to do is look at the story as they tell it. It doesn't exist. We did not come here on slave ships because you didn't have them. You didn't even have slave ships. So the Nina and the Pinta and all that stuff, they had those, but those are little bitty ships. Those are little bitty things. And that's why, you know, there is no museum full of slave ships. They'll show you one or two of them, but the question needs to be, where's the slave ship graveyard then? Where are you keeping them all? Where are you keeping all these ships that existed back then? They don't show that. You understand where I'm going?
Okay, so with all that being said, they're trying to, from the best of my comprehension, survive genetically. Why the misinformation to the tune of anything that goes beyond genetic survival? Like, what would be the positive consequences of lying to an entire nation of people about who they are so you can survive genetically in today's world?
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so ask the question. Oh.
Basically, in layman's terms, what's the deal with this fucking line? Like why? Like if the goal, yeah, if the goal is to survive genetically, what does my history have to do with your genetic survival versus my genetic survival by being miseducated in this system of American education and Western philosophies and whatnot?
Well, you got to look at the totality of the issue. I mean, first of all, genetic survival, you know, is paramount to the issue. So you can't move past that because everything is based off of genetic survival. And that's for everybody on the planet who has any sense in the first place. Okay, everyone's trying to survive. You know, that's part of being here. But with them, the way that they've had to set up a system for genetic survival is what we have to pay attention to. So understanding that genetically, these people cannot recreate with anyone on the planet and reproduce themselves. Okay, no one. The only people that they will come close to being able to do it with, and then they still can't, is Asians, or what we today modernly look at as the Asians. And because genetically, the modern day Asians and the Europeans genetically have the closest matches. So, with the fact that European women, historically and modernly, move with power. So wherever the power is where they go. They're not loyal to their men. So understanding this means that they have to create a system to where they procreate with each other, and that means that they have to stay in power. they have to stay in power. You can find this proven all throughout history. Okay? When the Albions came here, when the Germanic tribes came here, when the Europeans came here, you'll find recorded that their women literally would go into the tribes of the Moors who were here, the so-called Indians, okay? They would go into those tribes and they would stay there. They would abandon their men. Part of the reason that they would do that is simply because we were matriarchal and we had a higher degree of respect, not only for life, but for women. Within our matriarchal societies, women held positions of high esteem. And so, because in their societies, in European society and today, women are considered burdens. And especially then, because they did not go to war, they didn't do a whole lot of things, they weren't hunters. And so coming out of the Ice Age and so on and so forth, becoming nomadic tribes, the women were burdens. And so they were often traded for food, shelter, clothing, and so on and so forth. So that's where you get the fact that is documented that you can see from 1 AD on forward. And it actually is more ancient than that, but you can find the documentation easily starting at 1 AD. That the European woman was sold across the world as a sex commodity. So she was sold to other men. Now, understand that it was us buying her. It was us Moorish, Asiatic, African men buying her because we're the ones who had all the goods. So when the nomadic or Germanic tribes would come in contact with us all over the world, because they had nothing to offer, they had no vegetation. Europe doesn't produce anything that we would want. We were in the land of milk and honey. We were chilling. So the only thing that they could offer, well, we'll give you our women. And they would do that. Well, that meant that genetically they were wiping themselves out. So fast forward to over here, when they get here and the women are starting to themselves leave to come to us. That meant that again, they're not going to survive here genetically. So the wars have been going on with us since we can document it, at least from the Punic War. And it's very important to pay attention to those wars even in dealing with these issues. Because when we're talking about the change of the information, these are all of the different degrees of why the information has changed to create a system that perpetuates a fraud, miseducation, puts us in a certain mental position. So going back to the Punic Wars, or actually skipping up to the Dark Ages, when we go into Spain in 711, Andalusia is what it was called then. And we civilized them. And during that time, there's a book here, this book here, it's called The History of White People. And in this book, we're going to have you come in on a frame. In this book, I'm going to turn a couple of pages.
One sec.
In this book,
Got it.
it details the Moorish harems in
Right.
Andalusia. Got it?
Yeah.
And it deals with,
Good to go.
a part of it deals with the European woman being taken as a commodity all over the planet as a sex slave. And so in 742, the War of Poitiers with Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. Charles Martel is credited with being the victor in the most important war in European history. Now, the reason that he's given that credit is because in 742, the Mohammedans, this is what the Muslims were called before they were called Muslims, the Mohammedans and Muslims, M-O-S-L-E-M, were pushing all the way through Europe. So in 742, Charles Martel gathers the men that he could to bring an end to the Moors conquering all the way down the peninsula. Because remember, Europe is just a peninsula. It's not a continent. Okay, you're taught what a continent is. They tell you that Europe is a continent because, again, we're dealing with them perpetuating certain things in our minds. Europe is not a continent, it's a peninsula. The whole place is a peninsula. Now, what they'll tell you, the code words that they'll use is that if the Mohammedans had pushed all the way through Europe, all of Europe would be up under Mohammedan or Muslim control. That's what they tell you. That all of Europe would have then been under Christian control. Muslim control, Mohammedan control, and the Christians would have been knocked out. Now, Christian is just a code word meaning Germanic tribes. Okay, that's all. When they say that, they just mean the Germanic tribes. They just don't want to say all quote-unquote white people, because they know that these are statuses. White people don't exist. There's tribes. The Germanic tribes would have been wiped out or been under all of Mohammedan control. Now, they would have been wiped out because we just showed the documentation, or some of the pictures, we should say, that spoke about the Moorish harems. Because what the Mohammedans were going in doing is that they were taking the European women and then trafficking them all around the globe also. But also taking them into our harems and procreating with them. Now, this was producing a mass amount of amalgamation in Andalusia, or what you call Spain today. So when you hear about people who were Spanish, those are amalgamated people in most cases. Even Cortez, they were Moors. All those people were Moors. They were the children of the amalgamation that went on between the Albion woman and the Mohammedan men in Andalusia. So what they're telling you is that Charles Martel stopped the whole Germanic, Caucasian, European phenotype from being wiped out. Because at that point, all of them would have been under our control throughout that whole peninsula. And so we would have controlled who married who, and again, their woman would have been taken in as a commodity. Because that's part of what happens with war. And so he stopped them literally from being wiped out in 742. So when they come over here, they also understand the same principle. Is that this is a thing where they have to make sure that genetically they're fine. Now, one of the things that we did when they got here is that we signed a treaty of peace and friendship, a treaty of Tripoli. Because we, Moorish sons, were trying to stop the wars that had been going on between us for thousands of years with the Caucasian, Germanic sons. Well, again, this would have produced a mass amalgamation. Same issue. So you have the European Germanic sons who come and break the treaty. Now you hear them say this is the longest unbroken treaty. Not so much, that's not really true. because the treaty was signed and it had to do with being over here too. The treaty hasn't been broken with Morocco. Okay, because the Sultan of Morocco is who signed it. But remember, during the French invasions and so on and so forth. But the treaty has not really been standing over here, and that's where we have to come and resurrect that and stand on these treaties. So we signed the treaties, then they start the process of removing our birthright prior to that. So in 1774 through 1778, there's a meeting that takes place at Independence Hall, okay, in Philadelphia. It's called a meeting of the Odd Fellows. Now the Odd Fellows are a group of 33rd degree Master Masons who are Europeans. Now the meeting is a secret meeting because Masonry had been outlawed by the church and was punishable by death at this point. This is when they remove the titles of nobility from the Moors. Now those titles of nobility are the L's, the Bays, the Alis, the Alls, and the Dey, which is our attributes, or what you'll call last names. Those are our tribal lineage names, or titles, because we didn't have names. We had titles and attributes. When they remove those, they brand us Black, Negro, Ethiopian under this branding system now. Now, understand that is done based on removing the birthright, removing the line of descendability. You can't be descendable if you're not yourself. Meaning you can't not claim your mother and father and be descendable. So once they removed that line of descent, those titles and attributes and the knowledge of those, we automatically became not descendable. Now, this was a way that they constructed the 90 gear, the ens legis, and so on and so forth to remove our birthright to the land. Then they took those people, those amalgamated children, and signed treaties with them and allowed them to be called Indians, because they were the ones who sold out us to the Europeans in many cases. And so by removing these attributes and redoing the education system, now we no longer know who we are. So now their claim to our land and our birthright is safe. So then under Reconstruction, they began to rewrite the history books. And they introduced a new history into antiquity. They began to replace the ancient books, re-author them, and then to give them to us as if this is the history of the world. So this is where you get the introduction of this whole slave narrative that tells you that 20 million people came here on these boats, and that there was this ability to create this infrastructure and this scenario and so on and so forth that historically is incorrect. If you want to see the documentation of the true Aboriginal, Hitachian, indigenous people here, then you have to look at documents, portraits, paintings, drawings of us prior to 1750. Because they took the ones from 1750 forward and reconstructed them. And once you get to your mid-1800s, it's very difficult to find anything. So you can find them scattered from 1750 to your mid-1800s, but if you want to see the pure documentation, you have to go prior to 1750. Now, what they've done is that they've introduced the history to us for so long that we no longer identify with ourselves. So it goes back to the understanding of the elephant. when Dr. Joy DeGruy breaks it down very well in her discussions on post-traumatic slave syndrome, where she speaks about, if you take, they've shown scientifically through testing, that if you take an elephant and you give them a 2-foot chain, you tie one end of the 2-foot chain to a pole, and then one to one of the legs of the elephant. You leave the elephant chained up for approximately about 2 years. And during that 2 years, the elephant is just circling around the pole. What happens is that after 2 years, when you remove the chain, the elephant no longer goes out of that 2-foot circumference. Because now the elephant's brain has become adapted to that circumference, and now he knows nothing else. So he doesn't know to leave that area anymore. And this is the same state that we exist in. You have the ability, all of us have the ability, to remove the slave brands and the Christian nom de guerre that we operate under. Those are your Christian names and your first names that you have. But we don't even know to change them, because the lie has been given to us so long that we don't even think about it. We don't even walk around thinking about that a name like Walter Richards does not denote our heritage, because we don't denote our heritage anymore, because we've been so far removed from it that we no longer go out of that 2-foot circumference. We no longer go out of that circumference of that lie, because it's easier to believe the lie than the truth, which is the reason why scholars can go up to individuals and talk to them about this information. And our people will be like, no, you tripping. You know, you hate white people. This is the feedback you get, because they're in that 2-foot circumference. They can't leave it. Mentally, we've adapted, and our brain has now accepted this 2-foot circumference. That's all we got. That's all we know. And so now they no longer have to fear. They've given us the fear. They've given us all of the lies that indoctrinate us to now they no longer have to worry about us. So when they're telling us about slave ships, when they're telling us about these things, we don't even know that some of the information they're telling us is really about their history. They say that our ancestors were slaves, but the word slave comes from the word Slavic, which denotes the Slavic people being enslaved. And so this is where you get the state of being that's a slave or Slav. So the word itself is teaching you their history, but we're so far away from understanding etymology, linguistics, morphology, that we won't even research those little simple things, because we don't even know that they exist. We don't even know that etymology and linguistics, morphology as a science exists. So how are we going to study it? See? So that lie has us trapped in fear, and as long as you can keep people in fear, then you don't have to worry about it. You're taught that they came over here and they massacred the Indians, when in truth there was no mass gun producing industry either. There was over 100 million documented people here. 80% of the people who died based on disease. Most of your clans, the land that the clans had was left vacant because we had died off. We would meet up with Europeans, we would inhale their airborne viruses or the viruses in their food. We'd take them back into our clans, or what now is called tribes, spread them to everyone, and because these were foreign diseases to us, we had no cure. So whole tribes die off based on that. So then the Europeans, the Germanic tribes come in, find vacant land or dead people in this land, they take over the land. Then they tell you that some war took place and that they killed the people. Well, those stories become invented and come around because if I can teach you that every time your people fought me, they lost, you never want to fight me. You never want to fight me because you've never won. You never won the fight. So why would you stand up and fight now? We beat the hell out of you for the last 300 years. So why would you want to fight us now? So now you're in fear. So you think you can't rise up. Now you don't look to your spiritual system. They tell you that all of your people converted, and this and that, which is not true. In 1724, based on the Christian black codes, our spiritual systems were outlawed. But the missing piece that they leave out is that a lot of our people were converted to Christianity based on the fact that we were dying. So in a lot of the tribes, when we were coming down with these diseases, we didn't understand what was going on because these diseases was foreign. We were herbalists, but we had no need to have an herb for smallpox. Smallpox, chickenpox, and all those things come from living amongst animals, sleeping with your animals, eating after your animals. All those things, that's how you get those diseases. We didn't do that, we were clean. Well, every time we met up with Europeans, all of a sudden we're dying. And every time we met up with them, they were trying to get us to accept their doctrine of Christianity. So every time we didn't accept it, all we knew was that we were dying. So then we began to feel and to think that based on us not accepting their religion, we were dying. And that this was a message from God because God was punishing us for not accepting their religion. Because every time we didn't accept it, we died. We didn't know it was the diseases that they was giving us that was causing it. So eventually, we got spooked and scared and said this must be a message from God that we're supposed to convert to this new religion. We're dying when we don't. So many of your tribes, that's why they started to sign treaties. That's why you've seen a lot of them convert to Christianity. Because we thought it was a message from God. That this was the new religion or spiritual practice we were supposed to be accepting. And God was killing us for not doing it. That's what happened. But they say that based on the loving principles of Christianity, that we adopted them. No, we were scared. We thought that God was sending us a message through these people to convert because we were dying when we didn't. And so now we're afraid to turn away from it because we're so far into the fear factor now that we can't even see anything else. We can't see it. Our people are conditioned that whatever our spiritual system is our identity. And that's rightfully so. Because we understand our connection with the source or the one, no matter what you want to call them. Jehovah, Yahweh, Isa, Buddha, Krishna, Jesus, Yeshua, Emmanuel, all of those. We understand our connection. We understand the connection to something or a creative principle. And that is our identity. It's always been our identity. That's not new. What happened is that the enemy knows that that's your identity too. And so he planted, once he caught on to what was going on, now he removes your spiritual system and replaces it with his, which is the Constantinople Creed, or what we call Christianity. And teaches you that if you don't stay there, you die. You go to hell. And so this is what was going on during Reconstruction and how these things took place. And now we don't know any better. So we think that this is really how it's supposed to be. We think that we came on these ships, these slave ships. We think that these things really existed. And they didn't exist. The transportation didn't exist. You had a very minimal amount of people who could be transported based on the ships themselves. And last but not least, I'll say this. Anyone who is a fisherman, anyone who fishes, knows that it can be 100 degrees on land. Okay? It's 100 degrees on land. When you get out into a mile out, even if it's hot on land, when night hits on the water, it's freezing cold. Okay? Nightfall on water is freezing cold. Daytime on water is chilly a lot of the times. Unless the sun is directly hitting you when you're on the water, it's chilly. Now, why that's important? The other part of the story is that they tell you that our ancestors was in the hull. The hull is the bottom of the boat. The hull is in the water. So they're telling you that your ancestors were in the coldest part of the boat, butt naked, for 3 months. They would have froze. They would have caught all types of, diseases. On top of that, they would have froze. It's not a possibility. So we've got to think our way and do our way with action out of this issue. We've got to remove this mental enslavement because they've got you on that 2-foot radius. And until you're willing to leave it, that's where you're going to stay. Peace.